A childless millionaire finds 3 abandoned newborns at the doorstep of his mansion. As he approaches, he is shocked to discover that the babies look exactly like him. A DNA test reveals the truth. The hum of Ethan Harris's luxury sedan faded as he turned onto the long, tree-lined drive leading to his estate. Charleston's streets had been unusually quiet, a mirror to the void Ethan often felt after a day of hollow meetings and mindless pleasantries. Tonight, even the moon seemed shy, peeking faintly through a curtain of clouds. As the gates to his estate came into view, Ethan's headlights swept over something that didn't belong. A wicker basket sat squarely in the middle of the driveway, its humble silhouette stark against the grandeur of the wrought iron gates. He slowed the car to a crawl, the engine's soft purr breaking the silence. His brow furrowed, and his grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What the?" he muttered, glancing around the shadowy expanse for signs of movement. Nothing stirred but the faint rustle of leaves. Ethan parked and stepped out, his polished shoes crunching softly against the gravel. The cool night air brushed against his skin, sharpening his senses. He approached the basket cautiously, his shadow stretching long under the beam of his headlights. As he drew closer, a sharp, piercing cry cut through the stillness. Ethan froze. The sound wasn't just a cry, it was desperate, raw, and unrelenting. He took another step, then another, until he stood over the basket. Peering inside, his breath caught. 3 tiny faces stared up at him, their eyes squinting in distress, their mouths open wide as they wailed in unison. Each was wrapped in a blanket, their tiny fists punching the air as though protesting the world's cruelty. For a long moment, Ethan couldn't move. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. One of the babies kicked free of its blanket, revealing impossibly small toes and a trembling leg. The sight struck something deep in Ethan, a memory of a photo he'd seen as a child. His mother had once shown him a picture of himself as an infant, swaddled just like this. He crouched, his knees brushing the gravel, and carefully lifted the edge of the blanket covering another baby. The child's face, flushed and damp, was so startlingly familiar that Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. He looked at the second baby, then the third. "They're identical," he murmured, his voice tinged with disbelief. A folded piece of paper tucked into the basket caught his eye. He picked it up, the rough texture of the envelope grounding him momentarily. With unsteady hands, he tore it open and began to read. The letter was clinical, devoid of sentiment, yet its words hit like a sledgehammer. "Dear Mr. Harris, we regret to inform you of a grave error. Your genetic material, previously submitted to Fertility Solutions, was inadvertently used in a surrogacy procedure. The children in this basket are biologically yours." The words blurred as Ethan's mind raced. He had visited the clinic years ago, a fleeting, half-hearted attempt at preserving his legacy before dismissing the idea entirely. He'd signed the paperwork, gone through the motions, but he had never intended this. "Mine?" he said aloud, the word foreign and heavy on his tongue. He looked down at the babies, their cries softening as though sensing his presence. Ethan straightened, the letter crumpling slightly in his grip. His estate loomed behind him, its lights casting an eerie glow over the driveway. He felt the weight of his own isolation, the cavernous emptiness of a life built on success but devoid of connection. He knelt again, this time with more purpose. His hands hovered uncertainly over the basket before he finally picked it up, holding it close. The babies stirred, their cries subsiding into soft whimpers. Inside, the foyer of the mansion felt colder than usual. Ethan placed the basket on the marble floor, his movements deliberate but unsure. The opulence of his surroundings, grand chandeliers, polished wood, and priceless art, seemed almost cruel in the face of the fragility nestled in the basket. He sat down on the cool tile beside them, his elbows resting on his knees. The house was silent, save for the occasional rustle of blankets as the babies shifted. He reached out and gently touched the hand of one of the infants. Tiny fingers wrapped around his, gripping tightly. For a man who thrived on control, Ethan now felt utterly powerless. He exhaled slowly, his mind a chaotic tangle of questions with no immediate answers. A single thought broke through the noise. What now? As the babies drifted back into restless sleep, Ethan rose to his feet. He glanced at the basket one last time before stepping toward the living room. He would make calls, figure out what to do next. But as he turned, a weight settled in his chest. A strange mixture of dread and a flicker of something unfamiliar. Hope. For the first time in years, Ethan Harris wasn't entirely alone. The cries began again, slicing through the silence like a jagged edge. Ethan Harris sat on the cold marble floor of his sprawling foyer, his head in his hands. The basket, now resting a few feet away, seemed far too small to contain the chaos within. The three babies, nestled in their blankets, wailed in unison. Their tiny fists flailed in the air, faces scrunched and red. Ethan glanced at them, then at the pristine space around him. The crystal chandelier above refracted light across polished surfaces. Every corner of the room gleamed, perfect, untouched. This wasn't a house built for children. It was a monument to order and control, two things currently slipping through his fingers. "All right," Ethan muttered, pushing himself up. His voice cracked in the vast emptiness. "Okay. I can do this." He moved toward the basket, his movements hesitant, as though the babies might break under his gaze. One of them, he hadn't yet thought to assign names, kicked free of its blanket again. Ethan crouched and awkwardly tucked it back in, only for the baby to kick harder, its cries sharpening. "Guess you're not a fan of being swaddled," he said under his breath. His voice was meant to be soothing, but it came out stiff, unsure. A pungent odor wafted upward, and Ethan recoiled. "You've got to be kidding me." He carried the basket into the living room, setting it gingerly on the couch. The smell intensified. His stomach churned as he realized he had no supplies, no clue where to even begin. Rummaging through the house yielded nothing useful, no diapers, no bottles, not even a proper towel. By the time he returned to the babies, they were screaming at full volume. The sound bounced off the walls, amplifying his panic. "All right, I hear you," he said, louder than he intended. His tone startled even himself. He crouched again, lowering his voice. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that. I don't know what I'm doing here." One baby stared at him, wide-eyed. Its crying momentarily paused. Ethan felt his chest tighten. "What are you looking at, huh?" he said softly, his voice cracking. For a brief moment the house was still. Ethan sat cross-legged in front of the couch, his gaze fixed on the tiny faces before him. He studied their features. The delicate slope of their noses, the way their fingers curled reflexively, the rhythmic rise and fall of their chests. They didn't ask to be here, his mind whispered. Memories surfaced, unbidden. His own childhood home, spacious but cold, its warmth stolen by parents who treated him like an investment. The boarding schools, the endless expectations. The echoes of his father's voice, clipped and curt. "Legacy isn't optional, Ethan. It's your duty." Now here he was, faced with a legacy he hadn't chosen and didn't understand. The crying resumed, cutting through his thoughts. Ethan shook his head, snapping back to the present. "Right," he muttered. "Food. You probably need food." He opened the refrigerator and stared blankly at the neatly arranged rows of bottled water, imported cheeses, and prepackaged meals. Nothing even remotely suitable for infants. His phone buzzed on the counter, a rare sound that made him flinch. Ethan grabbed it, fumbling as he unlocked the screen. He hesitated before calling his assistant, Emily. She picked up on the second ring, her voice groggy. "Mr. Harris, it's nearly midnight. I need supplies," Ethan said. He glanced at the babies as he spoke, their cries unrelenting. "Diapers, formula, bottles, everything, now." Emily hesitated, clearly thrown off. "Are you all right, sir?" "I don't have time to explain. Just get someone to deliver them. Please." The last word felt foreign on his tongue, but desperation edged it into his voice. After a pause, Emily agreed, and the call ended. Ethan exhaled, his shoulders slumping. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as he paced the living room. The baby's cries ebbed and flowed like a relentless tide, filling every corner of the house. Ethan tried holding one, then another, rocking them awkwardly. Nothing worked. But in the brief moments when one would quiet, he'd catch himself staring. Their tiny features fascinated him in a way he couldn't explain. He saw traces of himself, his nose, his chin, and something deeper, something unnameable, flickered in his chest. As the first light of dawn seeped through the tall windows, a delivery van pulled up to the gates. Ethan let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding and hurried to retrieve the supplies. By the time he had fed, changed, and soothed the babies into a fitful sleep, exhaustion weighed heavy on his body. He sank onto the floor beside the couch, his head resting against the cushions. For the first time that night, the house was quiet. Ethan closed his eyes, only for the realization to hit him. He couldn't do this alone. He would place the ad first thing in the morning. Ethan stood in the massive living room, staring at the piece of paper in his hand. The ad he had drafted was concise. No fluff, no pretense. Caretaker needed immediately. Must be experienced with infants and capable of managing a challenging situation. He had sent it to a local agency earlier that morning, and by mid-afternoon, the phone rang with an appointment. Now, as the clock ticked toward the scheduled interview, he glanced around the room. Toys he didn't remember purchasing lay scattered across the pristine rug. A pile of diapers teetered precariously on the coffee table next to a half-empty bottle of formula. The babies were sleeping, for now, but their unpredictable cries loomed over the silence. The knock on the door was light but firm. Ethan squared his shoulders, his usual air of confidence replaced by something closer to uncertainty. He opened the door to find a woman standing there, her figure silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. "Mr. Harris?" she asked, her voice calm and measured. "Yes. Claire Bennett?" She nodded, stepping forward as he gestured her inside. Her presence was understated but purposeful. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun. Her eyes, though tired, carried a quiet strength. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Ethan began, leading her into the living room. "I'll get straight to the point. I have 3 infants in desperate need of care, and I have no idea what I'm doing." Claire's gaze shifted to the room. She took in the chaotic scene, the disarray, the faint smell of formula lingering in the air, and the basket now serving as a makeshift crib. She approached it with a gentle curiosity. "They're beautiful," she said softly, crouching to look at the sleeping babies. Her tone was neither patronizing nor overly sentimental, just genuine. Ethan cleared his throat, unsure how to respond. "They're a surprise, to say the least." Claire straightened and faced him. "I'll need to know the basics, how old they are, their feeding schedules, and any medical issues." Ethan hesitated. "I don't have those answers yet. They were left with me a couple of nights ago. I'm still sorting everything out." Her expression didn't shift, but Ethan caught the faintest flicker of something in her eyes. Pity? No, it wasn't pity. It was understanding. "Do you have their paperwork?" she asked. He nodded and handed her the envelope from the fertility clinic. As she read through it, her brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't comment. Instead, she placed the papers on the table and turned her attention back to him. "I've worked with infants before, but 3 at once is a challenge," she said. "It'll take time to establish a routine. And, I don't know if you've had much experience with children, but it's not just about keeping them fed and clean. They'll need stability, warmth, and someone who's willing to be patient." Ethan crossed his arms, his posture stiff. "Are you suggesting I'm not capable of that?" Claire's gaze didn't waver. "I'm suggesting that you're overwhelmed. And that's not a weakness, it's reality." Her bluntness caught him off guard, but it wasn't unkind. If anything, it was grounding. He found himself nodding. "Fair enough. So, do you think you're up for this?" Claire glanced back at the babies, one of whom had begun to stir. She reached into the basket, lifting the infant with practiced ease. The baby quieted almost immediately, its small face nestling into her shoulder. "I think they're worth it," she said simply. Ethan watched her, a flicker of relief breaking through his guarded demeanor. There was something about the way she moved, the way she spoke. She didn't ask unnecessary questions or fill the air with meaningless platitudes. "I'll hire you," he said finally. "On a trial basis." Claire didn't smile, but she nodded. "That's fair." As she settled into the house, Claire began to navigate the chaos with a quiet efficiency. She reorganized the supplies, set up a feeding schedule, and coaxed Ethan into participating. "If you're going to be in their lives," she said, handing him a bottle, "you need to learn how to do this." Ethan balked at first, his movements awkward and unsure. But under her steady guidance, he found himself adapting. Slowly, the mansion began to feel less like a museum and more like a home. Still, there was an unspoken distance between them. Ethan noticed how Claire avoided personal topics, deflecting questions with skillful redirection. He didn't press her, but the curiosity lingered. One evening, as Claire cradled one of the babies by the fireplace, Ethan watched from the doorway. The warm glow of the flame softened her features, and for a moment, he thought he saw a trace of vulnerability beneath her calm exterior. But when she looked up and met his gaze, her walls were firmly in place. "They're settling in better," she said, her voice steady. "Because of you," he replied, his tone quieter than he intended. For the first time, Claire's expression flickered. Not quite a smile, but something close. "They're not the only ones learning," she said. Ethan nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. Though they came from different worlds, they were both trying to navigate something entirely new, together, but apart. Morning sunlight streamed through the towering windows of Ethan Harris's mansion, painting the marble floors in streaks of pale gold. The once sterile silence of the house was now punctuated by the soft babble of babies, the rustle of blankets, and the occasional melodic hum from Claire as she worked. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. Claire's touch seemed to seep into every corner of the house, bringing a warmth that had long been absent. The dining table, once reserved for solitary meals, now held neatly arranged rows of bottles and jars of baby formula. The pristine living room rug bore faint stains from spilled formula and baby toys that no longer seemed out of place. Ethan stood at the edge of the room, sipping his coffee, his gaze fixed on the scene before him. Claire was on the floor, her legs tucked beneath her, as she coaxed one of the babies into holding a soft rattle. Her movements were deliberate, her voice soothing as she murmured encouragement. "You're quite the charmer, aren't you?" she said softly to the baby, who responded with a delighted squeal. Ethan watched as the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around the toy. A flicker of something unfamiliar stirred within him. Pride, perhaps, or gratitude. He wasn't sure. He set his mug down on the table, the sound breaking the moment. Claire looked up. "Good morning," she said, her tone light but guarded. "Morning," Ethan replied. He hesitated before stepping closer. "You've done a lot with the place." Claire glanced around, as though noticing the changes for the first time. "It needed it," she said simply, her gaze returning to the baby. The conversation hung in the air, incomplete but not uncomfortable. Ethan lingered, his hands in his pockets, before sitting down on the couch. "You're good with them," he said after a pause. "It's not hard," Claire replied, though there was a hint of something in her voice, an edge, perhaps, or an old wound. "Babies just need someone who's there for them. Someone consistent." Ethan frowned. "That sounds personal." Claire shrugged, deflecting the question. "It's true for anyone, really." The room settled into a companionable quiet. Ethan's gaze drifted to the other two babies, still dozing in their crib. "I didn't think this would work," he admitted quietly, his voice barely above a murmur. "What?" Claire asked, not looking up. "This? You. The babies. I didn't think I could do it." Claire paused, her hand stilling on the rattle. She turned her head, meeting his gaze for a long moment. "You're doing it," she said, her tone matter of fact. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Her words carried no judgment, just a simple acknowledgement. He nodded, unsure of how to respond. Late that night, the house was bathed in shadows, the soft glow of a single lamp in the nursery casting long shapes on the walls. Ethan stood by the door, watching as Claire rocked one of the babies in her arms. "You don't sleep much, do you?" he asked quietly, stepping inside. Claire glanced at him, a tired smile playing at her lips. "Neither do they." He leaned against the door frame, crossing his arms. "You said earlier that babies need consistency? Was that something you didn't have?" The question hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. Claire's expression faltered for the briefest moment before she masked it. "Everyone has their own story," she said finally. "That's not an answer," Ethan pressed, though his tone was gentle. Claire met his gaze, her eyes steady but distant. "It's the only one I'm giving right now." Ethan nodded slowly, sensing the boundary but not entirely satisfied. "Fair enough," he said, pushing off the doorframe. "But if you ever want to talk—" "I'll let you know," Claire interrupted, her voice softer this time. The baby stirred, letting out a tiny whimper. Claire focused her attention back on the infant, murmuring softly. Ethan lingered for a moment longer before retreating to his room. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that Claire's guardedness was more than just caution. It was a shield, one built over years of pain. The days stretched into weeks, and the routine became second nature. Ethan found himself stepping into roles he never imagined. Feeding, changing, even holding the babies during late-night fits of crying. He noticed how Claire's instructions grew less frequent, her corrections softer, as though she trusted him more. But even as the house grew warmer, a quiet tension simmered beneath the surface. Ethan began to recognize the small tells. The way Claire's smile never quite reached her eyes when he asked about her past, the way her shoulders stiffened at certain questions. It was like watching a tightly closed door, one he wasn't sure he had the right to open. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the study's tall windows, casting long, golden streaks across the polished wood floor. Ethan adjusted a stack of papers on the desk, the faint cries of the babies muffled behind the heavy door. He had escaped the chaos for a moment of quiet but found himself restless. The study was the only room that still reflected its original purpose, a sterile sanctuary for work, untouched by the warmth that had slowly spread through the rest of the house. As Ethan rearranged the books on a shelf, his hand brushed against something tucked behind a row of leather-bound volumes. A photograph. He pulled it free, his brows furrowing as he examined it. The image was faded, its edges worn from years of handling. It showed Claire, unmistakably younger, her hair looser, her smile wider. Beside her stood a man, broad-shouldered, with a cocky grin that made Ethan's stomach tighten instinctively. The way his arm rested possessively on Claire's shoulder spoke volumes. Ethan stared at the picture for a long moment, a knot forming in his chest. This wasn't the Claire he had come to know. There was something different in her posture, subdued, almost diminished. The contrast was unsettling. The door creaked open behind him, and he turned sharply. Claire stood in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as they fell on the photograph in his hand. "What's that?" Her voice was steady, but there was a flicker of unease beneath the surface. Ethan held up the picture, his expression unreadable. "I was tidying up. Found this behind the books." Claire stepped inside, her movements measured. She reached for the photo, but Ethan hesitated. "Who is he?" Her fingers froze mid-reach, and for a moment, the room felt too quiet. She lowered her hand and crossed her arms instead. "His name is Jake Walker," she said finally, her voice clipped. Ethan waited, but she didn't elaborate. He placed the photo on the desk and leaned against it, his arms crossed. "Claire, if there's something I need to know, now's the time to tell me." Her jaw tightened, and she exhaled slowly, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Jake and I were together for a few years. It wasn't healthy." "Not healthy?" Ethan prompted gently, sensing there was more. Claire's shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of her past pressed down on her. "He was controlling," she admitted. "Manipulative. It started small, little things I thought didn't matter. But it escalated. By the time I realized what was happening, I felt trapped." Ethan remained silent, his mind painting a picture from the fragments she offered. "I tried to leave," Claire continued, her voice quieter now. "But Jake didn't take rejection well. He made it clear that if I walked away, there would be consequences." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Did he hurt you?" Claire hesitated, her gaze finally meeting his. There was something raw and unguarded in her eyes. "Not physically. But sometimes, words can cut deeper than fists." The confession struck a chord in Ethan, stirring emotions he couldn't quite place. He pushed off the desk and took a step closer. "And now?" he asked. "Is he still a threat?" Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. "I haven't seen him in years. But men like Jake don't forget easily. If he finds out where I am..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "It's why I don't stay in one place for long." Ethan studied her, his mind racing. He saw the tension in her posture, the guarded way she spoke. It wasn't just fear, it was survival. "You should have told me," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. Claire's expression hardened. "And what would you have done? Fired me? Pushed me out before he could show up?" Ethan's response was immediate. "I would have protected you." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words lingering. Claire broke eye contact first, her arms tightening around herself. "I've spent a long time protecting myself," she said, her tone flat. "I don't need saving." The defiance in her voice was unmistakable, but it didn't erase the vulnerability Ethan had glimpsed moments before. "Maybe not," he replied, his gaze steady. "But you're not alone in this anymore. If he comes back, we'll deal with it. Together." Claire flinched at the word "we," as if it were unfamiliar territory. She opened her mouth to respond, but a sharp cry from the nursery interrupted her. "I should go," she said quickly, turning toward the door. "Claire," Ethan called after her. She paused but didn't look back. "If he's as dangerous as you say, we need to be ready. Don't keep me in the dark." Her shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath before she nodded curtly and disappeared down the hall. Left alone, Ethan picked up the photograph again, studying the man who had caused so much damage. Jake Walker's smirk seemed to taunt him from the paper. Ethan's grip tightened, his knuckles whitening. Whatever storm Jake might bring, Ethan knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let it touch Claire or the babies. Not while he was here. A car engine idling at the edge of the estate, just beyond the wrought iron gates, its low rumble barely audible over the rustling of the evening wind. Ethan Harris stood in the kitchen, washing an empty bottle, his senses prickling with unease. Claire had gone quiet after dinner, retreating to the nursery under the pretense of organizing supplies. The babies were sleeping soundly, their soft breaths a balm to the otherwise tense atmosphere that had settled over the house since their earlier conversation about Jake Walker. A second sound, footsteps on gravel. Deliberate. Heavy. Ethan set the bottle on the counter, drying his hands on a towel as he moved toward the front window. The figure at the gate was unmistakable. Broad-shouldered, cocky in stance, and illuminated by the estate's security lights, Jake Walker stood like a phantom from Claire's past. His leather jacket caught the glow, and his smirk was as sharp as the knife Ethan imagined he carried. "Damn it," Ethan muttered under his breath. He moved swiftly but quietly, heading toward the nursery. Claire was folding a blanket when he entered, her movements mechanical. She glanced up, her expression guarded but weary. "What's wrong?" she asked, reading the tension in his face. "He's here," Ethan said, his voice low. The blanket slipped from Claire's hands. Her face paled, and she gripped the edge of the crib for support. "Jake?" Ethan nodded. "He's at the gate. I don't think he's planning on leaving without a conversation." Claire's breathing quickened. She took a step back, her hands trembling. "He can't be here. He doesn't know when to stop." "Then I'll stop him," Ethan said firmly, his voice a calming anchor in the storm of her panic. Claire shook her head. "You don't know him, Ethan. He's dangerous." "And you think I'm not prepared for dangerous?" Ethan's gaze was steady, his voice like steel. "Stay here with the babies. Lock the door. Don't open it until I tell you it's safe." Before Claire could protest, Ethan was already moving. The front door creaked open, and Ethan stepped onto the porch, his figure silhouetted against the warm glow of the house. Jake leaned casually against the gate, his arms crossed. "Well, look who decided to show up," Jake drawled, his grin widening. "You must be the hero of the hour." Ethan descended the steps, his movements deliberate, his face unreadable. "You're trespassing," he said calmly. "Turn around and leave before this becomes a problem." Jake chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "Oh, it's already a problem, friend. I'm here for Claire. We've got unfinished business." Ethan stopped a few feet from the gate, his hands in his pockets, his posture deceptively relaxed. "Whatever business you think you have with her is over. She doesn't want to see you." Jake's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing. "That's not for you to decide. She's mine. Always has been." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his tone remained calm. "She's not yours. She's not anyone's. And she doesn't want you here." Jake took a step closer, gripping the bars of the gate. "You don't scare me, Harris. Guys like you think your money and your fancy houses make you untouchable, but trust me, I can reach anyone." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "You're not going to reach her. Not here. Not now. Walk away while you still can." For a moment, the air between them crackled with tension, each man sizing up the other. Jake's bravado faltered, his smirk twisting into a sneer. "You think you're a tough guy?" Jake spat, his voice rising. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "And you have no idea what I'll do to protect what matters to me. You're done here." Jake's hand twitched toward his jacket, and Ethan's eyes flicked to the motion. But before Jake could act, the sound of sirens split the night. Jake stiffened, his bravado replaced by a flash of panic. Ethan didn't move, his gaze locked on Jake as the police car pulled up. Two officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts. "Is there a problem here?" one of them asked, eyeing the scene. Ethan turned slightly, his voice steady. "This man is trespassing and threatening my household. I'd like him removed." Jake's smirk returned, though it was weaker now. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low enough for only Ethan to hear. Ethan's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, cold, unyielding. "Oh, it's over." The officers moved quickly, cuffing Jake and leading him to the car. He didn't resist, but his glare lingered on Ethan, a silent promise of future trouble. As the car pulled away, Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Inside, Claire stood in the nursery doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. The babies slept peacefully, unaware of the storm that had just passed. Ethan approached her, his expression softening as he reached out. "It's over," he said gently. Claire's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "For now," she whispered, her voice shaking. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "As long as you're here, he won't touch you. I promise." For the first time, Claire let herself lean into his strength, her walls cracking just enough for Ethan to see the vulnerability beneath. Together, they stood in the quiet warmth of the house, the shadows of the past fading into the night. The nursery was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of the baby's soft breathing. Claire sat in the rocking chair, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her eyes were fixed on the crib, but her mind was elsewhere. The adrenaline from Jake's appearance had long since faded, leaving only a hollow ache of exhaustion. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his footsteps barely audible against the plush carpet. In his hands, he carried 2 mugs of tea, the steam curling lazily into the dim light. He set one on the small table beside her and sank onto the floor, his back resting against the chair. "You don't have to say anything," he began, his voice low. "But I'm here if you want to." Claire's fingers gripped the armrests, her knuckles white. She stared down at Ethan, his face calm but watchful. For a long moment, the words hung heavy between them, unspoken. Finally, she broke the silence. "I don't know where to start," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan tilted his head back to look at her, his expression soft. "Start anywhere. There's no rush." Claire exhaled shakily, her hands relaxing. "Jake wasn't always like that," she began, her eyes distant. "When I met him, he was charming, funny. He made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered." Ethan remained silent, his gaze steady, inviting her to continue. "It wasn't until much later that I realized how much control he wanted. Every decision, every move, it had to go through him. At first, I thought it was love, the way he cared so much. But it wasn't." Her voice wavered, and she paused, staring at her reflection in the tea's surface. "When I tried to leave, he told me no one else would ever want me. That I'd never escape him." She swallowed hard. "And for a long time, I believed him." Ethan's hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Claire looked down at him, her voice softening. "I ran because it was the only thing I could do. I left everything, my job, my friends, my family, because I was too scared to stay. And I've been running ever since." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words filling the space. Ethan tilted his head forward, his hands resting on his knees. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "No one should have to go through that. Especially not alone." Claire blinked, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't know why I'm telling you all this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I haven't told anyone before. Because you trust me," Ethan said simply, looking up at her. "And you should." Her gaze met his, and for the first time, she let her guard down entirely. The tears spilled over, and she wiped at them hastily, but Ethan reached up, his hand gentle on hers. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're allowed to feel this?" Claire nodded, her breath hitching as she let the tears fall freely. Ethan stayed where he was, offering quiet comfort, his presence solid and unwavering. After a while, her breathing steadied, and she reached for the tea, cradling the mug in her hands. "You've been through things too," she said, her voice still thick with emotion. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "I have. Will you tell me?" He sighed, leaning his head back against the chair. "It's not the same as what you went through," he began, his tone reflective. "But I know what it's like to feel unmoored." Claire waited, sensing the weight behind his words. "My parents weren't the warmest people," he continued. "They believed in results, not emotions. Success was the only thing that mattered, and for most of my life, I thought they were right. I thought if I built enough, achieved enough, it would fill the gaps." He gestured vaguely to the room around them. "But it didn't. This house, the money, it's all empty without people to share it with." Claire studied him, her expression softening. "That's why you're doing this," she said. "With the babies, you want to fill the gaps." Ethan nodded slowly. "I do, but I'm terrified I'll mess it up. That I'm not enough for them." Claire leaned forward, resting her hand lightly on his shoulder. "You're more than enough, Ethan. You're here. You care. That's what matters." He looked up at her, the vulnerability in his eyes mirrored in hers. For a moment, the air between them shifted, heavy with unspoken emotions. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Ethan admitted quietly. Claire smiled faintly, her hand still resting on his shoulder. "You'd survive. But you don't have to do it alone." The words lingered, their meaning deepening the connection between them. As the night stretched on, they sat together in the quiet of the nursery, the babies sleeping soundly nearby. For both of them, the house no longer felt as empty as it once had. The children weren't just a responsibility, they were a beginning. A chance to heal, to build something meaningful, together. The garden was unrecognizable. Once a stoic expanse of neatly trimmed hedges and orderly paths, it now glowed with life and warmth. Strings of fairy lights crisscrossed above, casting a soft, golden hue over the space. A table with flickering candles sat at the center, surrounded by the gentle hum of night insects and the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Ethan stood at the edge of the garden, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. His nerves hummed as he glanced toward the house, where Claire was finishing putting the babies to bed. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say countless times, yet now, on the brink of the moment, the words seemed tangled in his chest. The sound of the back door opening drew his attention. Claire stepped out, pausing on the stone steps as her eyes took in the transformation. She wore a simple dress, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders, and the sight of her momentarily stole Ethan's breath. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice soft, curious. Ethan smiled, stepping toward her and offering his hand. "You'll see. Come with me." She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. He led her down the path, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. The garden seemed to wrap around them, the warm lights cocooning them in an intimate glow. At the center, Ethan stopped, turning to face her. "I wanted to do this properly," he began, his voice steady despite the rapid beat of his heart. Claire tilted her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "Do what?" Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. The smile on Claire's face faltered, replaced by wide-eyed surprise as he knelt before her. "Claire," he said, his tone soft but unwavering. "I don't know where I'd be without you. You've brought life to this house, to me. You've given me something I never thought I deserved, a family." Tears welled in her eyes as she stared down at him. "I know we've both had our struggles, and I know this won't always be easy. But I want to face every challenge with you. Not just as partners in this chaos, but as a family, together." He opened the box, revealing a simple yet elegant ring that sparkled in the candlelight. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Claire's lips trembled as she blinked back tears. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. He waited, his expression open, vulnerable. "Yes," she finally said, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes, I'll marry you." Relief and joy washed over Ethan as he stood, slipping the ring onto her finger. Claire threw her arms around him, and they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, the world falling away around them. Later that night, they sat together on the patio, the gentle hum of the baby's monitor a soft backdrop to the quiet night. The garden stretched before them, bathed in the warm glow of the string lights Ethan had hung earlier. Claire twirled the ring on her finger absent-mindedly, a faint but genuine smile playing on her lips. "I never thought I'd have this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan glanced at her, the corners of his mouth lifting in a tender smile. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both intimate and grounding. "Neither did I," he admitted, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I think that's what makes it matter so much, because neither of us expected it." The weight of his words hung in the air, their shared understanding deepening the bond between them. Claire's eyes softened as she looked at him, and for a moment, the world outside their garden seemed to disappear. They sat in comfortable silence, the flickering lights casting dancing shadows across the patio. Above them, the stars glittered faintly, as though bearing witness to the life they were building. The next morning, the house was alive with energy and light, a stark contrast to the stillness of the previous night. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting the walls with golden hues. The once quiet living room buzzed with the joyful chaos of their new life. Claire cradled one baby against her chest, humming softly as the infant's tiny fingers curled around the fabric of her shirt. Ethan stood nearby, gently rocking another baby in his arms, a rare and unguarded smile softening his features. Across the room, the third baby cooed happily from a nearby swing, their chubby arms flailing in delight. The living room, once pristine and cold, was now a vibrant mess of toys, bottles, and laughter. Soft blankets were draped across the back of the couch, a colorful playmat sprawled across the floor, and a half-assembled crib leaned against the wall. It was imperfect and chaotic, but it was theirs. A reflection of the family they were becoming. Though the challenges of their pasts weren't erased, they no longer held the same weight. The echoes of loneliness and fear that had once defined them were now replaced with something stronger: love, resilience, and the shared determination to move forward. Of course, there were still hurdles to overcome. The legal battles with the fertility clinic loomed in the background, their resolution uncertain. Navigating their new lives, filled with unexpected responsibilities and fragile bonds, required patience and care. But these struggles no longer felt insurmountable. They had each other, and that was enough. Ethan glanced at Claire as she adjusted the baby in her arms, her face illuminated by the morning light. Her expression was serene, content, but there was also strength in her gaze, a strength he admired deeply. She caught him looking and smiled, a quiet but profound reassurance that they were exactly where they were meant to be. And as Claire looked back at Ethan, her heart swelled with gratitude. She had spent so long running from her past, never daring to hope for a future like this. But now, in the laughter of the babies and the steady presence of the man beside her, she saw not just a new beginning, but a home, a place where the broken pieces of her life had finally come together. Together, they had built something far greater than just a home. They had created a life, a family, and a future filled with love, resilience, and hope. Ethan, once a man consumed by loneliness and uncertainty, now watched Claire laugh softly at one of the baby's playful antics. In that moment, he felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude wash over him. The woman who had entered his life as a stranger, through an unexpected twist of fate, had become his rock, his partner, and the undeniable heart of his home. As Claire glanced back at him, her eyes sparkling with joy and love, her smile spoke of newfound hope. She realized that the broken fragments of her past, the pain, the fear, and the scars, had finally found a place where they fit perfectly. With Ethan and the children, she had found not only a sense of belonging but also the courage to embrace a brighter future. The story didn't end with perfection but with the promise of endless possibilities. A promise of love that grows stronger in the face of adversity, resilience that rebuilds even the most fractured lives, and the remarkable beauty of finding light in the most unexpected places. If this story has touched your heart, leave your mark by giving it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. By joining us, you'll explore even more meaningful, heartfelt stories that inspire and uplift. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We want to hear your feelings, your reflections, and your own stories. Every word you share helps us build a warm and enduring community where connections are formed and hearts are touched. Together, we can create a welcoming space where everyone feels valued and understood. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories we have lined up for you. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you the best selections, stories that entertain while delivering deep, emotional, and meaningful messages. Stay tuned for more tales of hope, love, and transformation. See you soon, and thank you for being part of this journey with us. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.